Hey guys, well, we survived the election despite all the insanity caused by Trump's baseless accusations and frivolous lawsuits. I had to take a break from making videos because it turns out that I'm still a PhD student, and researching, scripting, and publishing 5 videos in a 10-day period while being a student is not easy to do. Hopefully I can post more consistently, though I won't promise anything right now. I want to talk about something that I get asked about fairly frequently. How can I discern real news from fake news? But I want to try to explain how I think about these things, with a few caveats. First, please know that I am not an expert in interpreting internet sources. Some of my methods might work for you, and some might not. I certainly don't always get everything right. Second, most of what I'm going to talk about here comes from my own thinking, but I did get some of it from other resources, which I've linked in the description. So please give those a watch or a read in order to learn more about these things from people who spend a lot more time thinking about these issues than I do. Third, this is probably the most important part. No source is perfect because no human is perfect, and humans create sources. So although I'll recommend a couple outlets, please don't think that I'm saying that everything they say is the gospel truth, because they're definitely not. Fourth, and relatedly, not all sources are created equal. Some are generally trustworthy and some are generally not. The agnosticism that I've seen lately, where some folks seem to believe that one source is just as good as the next because we just can't know what's true, is so mind-bogglingly wrong as to almost be funny. Except it's not, because, well, we're dealing with the truth. And fifth and finally, throughout much of this video, I'm going to encourage you to read. I know some folks hate reading, but I think that it's really important to use written sources for reasons that I'll get into later. So I'd recommend that you use sites or apps that can read the text to you if you prefer to hear the information rather than reading it directly. Misinformation spreads really easily on social media. Someone can make a claim in a post, and regardless of whether it's true, it can get shared countless times because people take it at face value. You know that bit about don't believe everything you read on the internet? Well, we need to apply that a lot better than we are. So now that that's out of the way, how do we evaluate a source? How do we know what's true? The easy answer to how do we evaluate a source is Ad Fontes Media. Their media bias chart is created by a bipartisan group that reviews stories by each outlet and then ranks them based on their general factual accuracy and their political bias. I don't completely agree with all of their rankings, but it's a pretty good starting point. Another good resource is Ground News, which breaks down the coverage of a topic by left, center, and right-wing sources. It can be helpful in identifying which blind spots we have in terms of which parts of the political spectrum aren't covering a story. Now, both Ground News and Ad Fontes Media are good starting points, but how do you know if a specific story is true? Well, ultimately, unless you're there, it's difficult to know with absolute certainty, but it's certainly possible to know with a fairly high degree of confidence. So the harder answer to how do we evaluate a source or a story is pretty complex, but it's definitely manageable. I tend to use a few loose criteria, though not systematically and definitely in no particular order. Some of these are questions while others are general maxims. Before I get into that though, just one quick note. I always prefer written sources over watching the news. Why? Because the written word is easier to check than a news story or a video, and they'll usually tell you more explicitly what their sources for a story are. So here are my general rules for evaluating stories and news sources. Remember, this is not an exact science, it's more of an art. First, who or what are the sources cited in a story? Do they have documents, photo, audio, or video evidence? This is kind of tricky. On the one hand, if a reporter writes an article and tells you their sources by name, they seem more reliable. But just saying your source is Bob the Tomato or Larry the Cucumber doesn't mean a story is true. For example, if I'm writing a story and cite a statement by the White House press secretary presenting that information as a fact, there's a danger that what I'm saying is false because the press secretary has traditionally been in a position that entails a lot of spin and sometimes flat out lying. This has only gotten worse with the Trump administration, though I don't expect a complete improvement under Biden. So we need to be cautious when we're dealing with government statements or public comments by officials on the facts of a particular matter, though some parts and members of government have developed a slightly better reputation in this regard. For example, the intelligence community. But then there are anonymous sources. On the one hand, anyone can theoretically say that an anonymous source told them XYZ and then print it in an article. On the other hand, there are good reasons for sources to remain anonymous. For example, oftentimes sharing information that these sources leak to the press can get them fired. So it's impossible to say every anonymous source is wrong or every anonymous source is right. but there are a few ways we can determine the veracity of a statement by a named or anonymous source. On the one hand, if a source is saying something negative about an organization or administration of which they're a part, there's a decent reason to believe them. Additionally, without having access to documents, recordings, etc., you could cross-check an anonymous statement with other such statements and with what you already know about an administration or organization, person, or event being discussed by that anonymous source. I'll get back to this later. A quick note about non-human sources, like pictures, audio, video, and documents. I tend to trust documents quite a bit, likely because I'm a diplomatic historian, so I'm used to relying on them. But documents can be forged, so it's usually best to wait and see if a major news outlet or an expert has verified if a leaked document is legitimate. In terms of pictures, audio, and video, just know that these can also be deceiving, whether intentionally or unintentionally. Someone might start recording too late or stop recording too early or get a picture at the moment that looks bad or awkward. They could also edit a picture, audio, or video file to have that effect. So not every picture, video clip, or audio recording is guaranteed proof that something happened in a particular way. It's just a snapshot. And so it's usually best to wait for more facts to come out before rushing to judgment. One last important point about sources. Sometimes I see people say, who fact checks the fact checkers? Well, the answer should be you. You can fact check them or literally any other article. Look at the sources they use. Sometimes they'll name a source or provide pictures, video, audio, whatever. Other times, they'll link to other articles. This is especially true with fact-checking sites. Take a look at the outlets they're citing. Read some of what they cite. In my experience, fact-checking websites tend to do a pretty good job, and they can be a great starting point for finding reliable sources on a particular story or piece of information. They aren't always right, of course, but they're usually pretty reliable. The second big question in figuring out whether a story is true is who else is writing on this issue? Do their accounts match up with this one? To what extent? Are they just parroting, or do they have their own sources? This should be pretty self-explanatory, but it is so important to do what some people call lateral reading, meaning that you look into other sources to verify whether a story is true. Sometimes other news outlets or sources won't have anything written yet about an event or issue because the news is just that fresh. But once they do, what are their sources? Are they simply repeating what the other outlet said, or do they have their own separate sources? Do their stories match up? Do they contradict each other? Do they do so in a big way or small way? Do they have a good track record of highly accurate reporting? A third important question is, does this make sense in light of what I've read elsewhere on this topic, individual, organization, whatever? If yes, I tend to think it's true, but it doesn't mean it is. Neither does the failure of a story to match a pattern mean that it's false. You should use these methods together. It's just one more filter to run information through. Fourth, does this outlet have a track record of publishing quality work, or do I often find their product to be subpar? And if you do find it subpar, is it because you found other sources that are more reliable that contradict them? Is it because of explicit bias, or is it because you just feel they're wrong or you don't like what they say? Be careful when you're evaluating sources like this. In my experience, I found that major outlets like the New York Times, Washington Post, CBS, Politico, NPR, The Guardian, and the BBC tend to be pretty solid. The Wall Street Journal and Forbes, which are conservative, are also pretty good. Newswire services like AP and Reuters are quite consistent in terms of their accuracy. These are just my personal preferences, and you're free to evaluate outlets for yourself, but remember to do so carefully. And again, the Ad Fontes Media bias chart is a really, really helpful resource for this. Fifth, how obvious is this outlet's bias? If they only ever say good things about a person or a group, take any positive coverage of that organization or individual with a grain of salt. Same with if they only say bad things. Again, using Ad Fontes is really helpful here, as is doing research into the reliability of an outlet or who actually owns the outlet, because that can tell you a lot about their interests and how that impacts their reporting. Sixth, if the title of an article is sensationalist and, flashing lights, you probably shouldn't believe it. And if you do read it, you should fact check it. Seventh, if you don't recognize the name of an outlet, that's a sign you should research it. Don't just believe what they write because their website is well designed or because the story agrees with your preconceived notions. Eighth, read and check an article or post before you share it. Misinformation and disinformation spread fastest when we don't use these safeguards. If you wouldn't want someone spreading rumors or telling lies about you, don't do it with news and other forms of information. Ninth, as a general rule of thumb, don't trust anything from Breitbart, One America News, Huffington Post, Western Journal, or sources like them. There are a lot more sources that are pretty trash, but I don't really have time to go into all of them right now. A good rule of thumb is if their news articles sound more like opinion pieces than news, get out of there. Really, this all comes down to you caring about the truth and putting in the work to make sure that what you're sharing and reading is reliable and accurate. Read critically and broadly, including outlets that you might not like, but that are reliable. Use a search engine like Google or DuckDuckGo. Check the links that articles use to cite their sources. Be an intelligent consumer of information and a thoughtful sharer of it. Part of the reason why we're so divided right now is because we can't agree on simple facts. So do your part and check your sources. Thanks for watching. Be safe.